This lecture is about climate and the distribution of plant communities globally and locally. The specific focusing questions are: what factors shape global climate and the distribution of biomes? What biomes are present locally and how is their distribution affected by climate? And what can one learn from a climograph? So please keep these focusing questions in mind as we proceed through the material. Your book described the characteristics and distribution of biomes, but didn't explain why these patterns exist. I'm going to try to fill that void with this lecture by explaining first what causes the seasons, which are defined as annual changes in atmospheric conditions and or the amount of daylight. So as you can see from this diagram, there are two factors that are really important in determining the seasons on our planet. One of them is the tilt of the Earth, and the other is the rotation of the Earth around the sun. So the first picture right here is showing us the position of the planet relative to the sun when it's summer in the southern hemisphere. So as you can see in this picture, the southern part of our planet is facing the sun. So they're going to be receiving more sun, and then the northern hemisphere is going to be receiving less. So this is December when it's winter in the northern hemisphere. And then you can see down here in June, the northern hemisphere is now facing the sun. The southern hemisphere is tilted away from the sun. So that means it's summer in the northern hemisphere and winter in the southern hemisphere. So these patterns are changing how much solar radiation is being delivered to different places on our planet, therefore causing these seasonal changes in the amount of light, but also in the atmospheric conditions. It could be the temperature, or it could be the amount of precipitation. Another important factor that drives the distribution of biomes by shaping global climate is something called uneven heating. This diagram is showing us the sun over here in yellow, and it's showing us rays from the sun being delivered to the northern part of our planet and then also to the equator. And as you see here in the northern part of the planet, the same amount of solar radiation is diffusing over a larger area of the Earth. In the tropics, there's more direct sunlight diffusing over a smaller land area. So that means although we've got the same amount of solar radiation, because it's diffusing over a greater area at the poles, we end up getting less heat and less solar energy being delivered to the areas in the far north and the far south of our planet. Another important factor that drives the distribution of biomes by shaping global climate is the uneven heating of the Earth. As you can see in this diagram, solar radiation that comes to the poles versus the tropics is diffusing over a larger area. So here we have the same amount of solar radiation directly reaching the tropics and diffusing over a smaller land area. This means that there's over twice as much heat and solar energy being delivered to the tropical locations in our planet, the areas close to the equator, as is being delivered to the poles, the northern and the southern regions of our planet. So this not only means that there's big discrepancies in temperature, generally there's warmer temperatures close to the equator, it also means that there's a huge difference in the amount of energy that plants can potentially take advantage of through the process of photosynthesis. This figure shows us the impact of this uneven heating of the planet. The lines in this map represent isobars, so areas where the temperature is the same on the planet. And we can see here that due to the uneven heating of the planet by the sun, the regions near the equator are much warmer than the regions of the planet that are at the extreme northern and southern poles. Uneven heating drives another very important atmospheric phenomenon called air mass circulation. And air mass circulation is driving many of the patterns of wind across our planet, and it's also responsible for a lot of the variability in precipitation that we see in different regions of the planet. So recall that there's a lot of solar radiation and heat being delivered to the tropics. So there's a lot of warmth, and as air, these cells represent the atmosphere above our planet. As the air gets warmed at the equator, it rises. Warm air is less dense than cold air. So as it heats up, it rises. And as it rises, it's going to cool. So the upper parts of the atmosphere, at least the lower part of the atmosphere where we live, the troposphere, are cooler. And cold air can't hold as much moisture as warm air. So at the tropics, we have these warm, moist air masses rising and then cooling. And as they cool, the water that's held in that air, that humid air, condenses and it falls as rain. So as you can see down here on this diagram, we have a high amount of annual precipitation occurring in the tropics. And that's because of these warm air masses rising in the tropics. Just another little explanation about this figure. So think of these cells as like inner tubes that go all the way around the planet. Each of these cells goes all the way around the planet. This is a cross section through one of those cells. Okay, so we've got warm air masses rising in the tropics. As they rise, they cool and they drop a lot of precipitation in the tropics. So now we have a dry air mass that's just lost its precipitation, and that's going to eventually start to descend because it's cold now and it's more dense. So we have dry air masses descending at 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south latitude. This type of atmospheric condition impedes rain, impedes the processes that we just talked about that happen at the equator. And that dry, cold air, when it heats up, when it gets close to the surface of the planet, it can actually suck moisture out of the soil and the water bodies on the land. So if we take a look at this graph, we see precipitation peaking at 0 degrees latitude, which is the equator, but at 30 north and 30 south, we see relatively low amounts of precipitation. If we look further north, we see once again at about 60 degrees north and south, warm air masses rising. And that explains why we see two peaks in precipitation occurring at 60 degrees north and 60 degrees south latitude. The uneven heating and patterns of precipitation driven by air mass circulation are hugely important in determining the distribution of biomes globally. You saw this map of biome distribution in your reading for this week. Recall that a biome is a major regional biological community, such as a desert or a forest. And if we take a look at this map, we can see the impact of the phenomenon we've been talking about in terms of the global climate on the distribution of biomes. So the green on this map represents tropical rainforests. And as you can see, these forests are limited to the regions of the equatorial regions of our planet, where we have lots of heat, lots of solar energy, and a huge amount of precipitation. If we look further north in latitude, we see a lot of this beige or gray color. These represent the deserts. So at around 30 degrees north and at around 30 degrees south latitude, where we saw the dry air masses descending on the planet, we see huge swaths of desert. Further north, where we start to get more precipitation, we see more forests. So trees require a lot of water. So we see the temperate and the boreal forest distributed across the northern part of our planet. This figure shows two climographs for two very different regions of our planet. The first one is from Banda Aceh, Indonesia, which is located at about 5 degrees north latitude, and it's pretty much located at sea level. The second climograph is from Cairo, Egypt, which is located at about 30 degrees north latitude and also pretty close to sea level. What we see here is huge differences in the amount of precipitation. Climographs simultaneously show temperature, which is given on the left axis, and precipitation, which is given on the right axis on these two figures. And precipitation is illustrated by the blue line. So as you can see, we've got a lot of precipitation in this particular location in Indonesia and really low precipitation in this location in Egypt. We see that in Banda Aceh there's very little change in the temperature throughout the year. It's a little more seasonal, a little change. Here in Egypt, we see that the average temperature is in the 50s or 60s in the winter, and then it rises in the summer to maybe closer to 70 or 80 degrees Fahrenheit. So this is a result of the phenomenon that we just talked about. Close to the equator, we have warm air masses rising, delivering a lot of precipitation. We also have relatively little change in the temperature due to the location close to the equator. There's not a lot of seasonal differences in this particular location. As you get further away from the equator, you see bigger temperature swings, and because Egypt, this particular location is in Egypt, is located in one of those high pressure areas where we have dry air masses descending. We see very, very little precipitation throughout the year. You guys should be able to examine climographs and interpret the data that you see, just as we just did. Okay, so uneven heating and air mass circulation are crucial in determining the distribution of biomes on the planet, but there are other factors at play. One of them is the proximity to a large body of water. This map shows us Oregon. So this is a section of Oregon, and it highlights the differences in temperature in Astoria, which is located up here on the coast, and Pendleton, which is located by this red pin further inland. Astoria, being on the coast, has a more what we would call a maritime climate, whereas Pendleton has a more continental climate. As you can see from the table, Astoria is less than 1 mile from the ocean, whereas Pendleton is 250 miles inland. The average temperature in January is going to be about 42 degrees Fahrenheit in Astoria, whereas it's going to be 34 degrees Fahrenheit in Pendleton. The average temperature in August, however, is going to be lower in Astoria, about 61 degrees Fahrenheit, whereas it's about 73 degrees Fahrenheit in Pendleton. What we're seeing here is a moderation of the temperature change on the coast as a result of the proximity to the Pacific Ocean. Water has an extremely high specific heat, which means it takes more energy to heat up water than it does other substances like the air. So the Pacific Ocean stays relatively consistent in its temperature, which warms up Astoria in the winter and cools it down in the summer. So what we see here is a much smaller range of temperatures in this maritime climate compared to the range of temperatures in Pendleton, which we would consider to be a more continental climate. Topography also has a huge impact on climate. Topography affects the wind patterns. Specifically, it can cause something called orographic lift, which we see here. And that just means that a big mountain will cause an air mass to rise up in elevation. As that happens, as you know, as we go up in elevation in the troposphere, it gets colder. So we've got warm, relatively warm air coming off the ocean in this diagram. Orographic uplift causes it to rise and cool. And as we know, cold air can't hold as much moisture as warm air. So the moisture in that air mass as it cools is going to condense and fall as precipitation, either snow or rain, on the windward side of this mountain. On the other side of the mountain, we have what's called a rain shadow. The rain shadow is associated with the leeward side of a mountain. We see this really dramatically in the Sierra Nevada mountains of California. There's a lot of moisture on the west side, and they're really relatively dry on the east side. What's happening is now we have a cold, dry air mass, so it's dropped its moisture on the windward side of the mountain. And so now we've got dry air descending down the mountain, heating up, maybe even causing the moisture in the soils to evaporate. And what we end up with is a really dry, high desert, or desert in some cases, on the eastern side of the Sierra Nevada mountains. So that's called a rain shadow. So topography, proximity to large bodies of water, both have huge impacts on climate. In general, we can see the impact of topography on climate when we examine the distribution of plant communities along an elevation transect. Many early plant biogeographers or early ecologists like C. Hart Merriam and Humboldt were really interested in looking at the distribution of plants along elevational gradients and also latitudinal gradients. C. Hart Merriam coined the concept of a life zone, and he noted that walking up in elevation from a desert to a really high alpine peak was kind of like walking from the southern region of the United States up in latitude all the way to the Arctic tundra. So this was his idea of the life zone concept. And as we can see here, it grades from a desert to sort of a high desert up into a mixed conifer forest, and then a forest that's more of a boreal forest dominated by fewer tree species, coniferous tree species, and then finally up above tree line where you have very few trees and more herbaceous plants. So C. Hart Merriam decided to collect data for his life zone concept on Mount Shasta. And this is a figure in the report that he produced from his survey on Mount Shasta, where he shows the life zone transitions that occur as you walk up from the Shasta Valley, which he called the Upper Sonoran life zone. So this is kind of a high desert life zone, up in elevation to a transition forest, which is sort of like our typical mixed conifer forest dominated by ponderosa pine. And according to Merriam, that went up to about 5,500 feet on Shasta. Up above that, he coined the term the Canadian life zone, which on Shasta is dominated by the Shasta red fir. It's almost the only overstory tree in that forest. Up above that, we'd have what he referred to as the Hudsonian zone, which on Mount Shasta, you would see a lot of white bark pine. And then finally, you'd get up into the alpine area, which resembles the Arctic tundra. Some people would refer to that as an alpine tundra, where you have herbs growing above the limits of tree growth. So the climate is such that trees can't survive, but there are some herbaceous plants that can survive in the alpine tundra. So this concept and the dramatic changes that we see in plant communities as we walk up a mountain like Mount Shasta show what a dramatic effect topography can have on local climate and how that has a huge influence on the plant community. Now I want to focus on California's climate, which is no small task. The climate of California is extremely diverse. You've got the influence of the Pacific Ocean, which lies west of our continent. You've also got the influence of some major mountain ranges. Here we see the Sierra Nevada and then the Klamath Mountains, also the Coast Ranges. And then we also have heavy influence from the high pressure zone around 30 degrees north latitude, which is especially influential to the climate in the southern part of our state. This map shows precipitation grading from really low. The red is 0 to 5 inches to really high. Over 100 inches of precipitation is purple, which we see in the far northwestern corner of California. The climates are diverse, and as a result, it's no surprise that there's a huge diversity in the biomes that we see in the state of California. So everything from deserts in the rain shadow of some of the mountain ranges, and in the southern part of our state where we have the influence of the high pressure zone. We have lots of areas that are dominated by coniferous forests. Your book described the temperate forests, and it was really focused on the temperate deciduous forests, which is lacking in California. There isn't enough moisture in the summertime to support deciduous trees. But many would consider the coniferous forest to be a type of temperate forest. We also have areas of alpine tundra, which resemble the Arctic tundra, and many areas of chaparral in the state of California. Now we're going to hone in on Northern California, Northwest California, and I just wanted to show this map to illustrate that nearly all of the categories of precipitation that are depicted on this map can be found in Siskiyou County. So we have a huge range of climates in a small area in Siskiyou County, and that has a huge influence on our local plant communities. So as you know, the climate in general in California is a Mediterranean climate, which means we have cool, moist winters and dry, hot summers. We have areas that experience a more maritime climate, like we saw in Astoria, Oregon, when there's a smaller range of temperatures. And then we have areas further east where it's a more continental climate, where the extremes in temperature are more diverse. We see on this map more precipitation at higher elevation, less precipitation in valleys. If you see here, this little dot is Mount Shasta. So as air masses rise up Mount Shasta, they're cooling. The moisture in those air masses is condensing and falling down as snow or rain on the mountain. We see in general that precipitation is declining with distance from the coast, except for sort of in this region where we actually see it's a little bit higher than it was west of the Klamath Mountains. So what's going on here is air masses in the winter often come up the Central Valley, and as they rise, they drop a lot of moisture in this central region of Northern California. If we take a look at the map, we see up above it, the conditions are much drier, and that's because this is an area that's in the rain shadow of the Klamath Mountains. So we have huge diversity in climate locally, and it has many impacts on our plant communities. The warm, dry California summers present a challenge for plants. As you read about in your book, plants require warmth and moisture at the same time in order to really thrive. So in California, they're getting one or the other. They're getting moisture in the winters, but it's not necessarily that warm. And then they're getting a lot of heat in the summers, but they aren't getting both of those things at the same time. So many plants are dormant during the dry season in the summer, and they're doing most of their growth in the winter or the spring, depending on the elevation, when the soils are moist. This kind of climate favors evergreen plants. So we have a really high diversity, especially of coniferous evergreen plants in Siskiyou County. Conifers are generally better at surviving dry conditions. So their leaves are needle-like leaves, as you know. They have a lower surface area compared to their volume, so that reduces the amount of water that they're losing through their stomata. Think about the surface area of a needle compared to the surface area of a big, thin, flappy, deciduous leaves. Those leaves are much more prone to water loss. Therefore, coniferous plants are better adapted to dry conditions like we have in the summertime in California. Conifers can also photosynthesize all year round. Other evergreen plants can as well. So they still have leaves in the winter when we are getting some sun, and if the conditions are warm enough, they're going to be getting moisture as well. So they can photosynthesize all year round. A deciduous plant can't photosynthesize all year round. Sometimes there's some photosynthesis going on in the stem, but they've dropped their main photosynthetic organs, their leaves, in the fall. So we tend to see deciduous trees in our area relegated to areas where there's a consistent source of water, like the riparian areas around streams or areas adjacent to a lake. The climate in California is also very conducive to fire. So these wet winters support abundant plant growth. However, the vegetation becomes extremely dry in the summers. So this is a recipe for fire. And fires in California are generally coming in the late summer or the early autumn when the vegetation is really dry. Many of the fires are caused by lightning strikes, so there's not a lot of rain in the summer months, but occasionally there are thunderstorms in the mountains that are associated with lightning. So those lightning strikes are responsible for a lot of the forest fires in Northern California and throughout the state. This consistent fire regime that California has seen in recent history is a major driver of evolution in our plant communities, and it's also a major ecological driver within our plant communities. So we see many organisms that are adapted to fire, like Douglas fir with thick bark and knobcone pine with cones that require fire in order to release seeds. And we also see many ecosystem processes like regeneration being associated with fire. It's a very important component of the California forests. So in general, you should understand what drives global and local patterns of temperature and precipitation, including uneven heating, air mass circulation, proximity to large bodies of water, topography. You should be able to read and interpret climographs like the one you saw in this presentation, and you should understand how climate impacts our local plants. You may want to refer to these sources which I cited in this presentation for more information about climate and plants.